Okay, so welcome to the WUDC Distinguished Speaker Lectures. In these talks, we aim to spotlight exceptional debaters with unique perspectives on the world. Each talk will consist of three elements. The speaker will present their topic and the research, work, or experience in the field. The speakers will connect the topic to debating, and then we're going to wrap up the discussion with a Q&A section. The first few episodes all revolve around gender and feminism and are organized in cooperation with the Gender Open Competition. Today, our speaker is Sharmila Parmanand. Sharmila is a PhD student in gender studies at the University of Cambridge and a Gates Scholar. She was previously a lecturer at the University of Melbourne and Ateneo de Manila. She has a master's in gender development from the University of Melbourne on an Australian Leadership Award scholarship. Sharmila has been active as a debater in over 50 countries, AlgCore tournaments such as WUDC, Australs, and Euros. She is the CA of the upcoming WSDC and a 3 times Asians winner. Sharmila's talk is titled Saving Our Sisters, a critical perspective on the representation of sex work as victimhood in anti-trafficking discourse, and is centered around sex work. I'm Dan Lahab. I'm going to host the talks, and notes of the talks are going to be recorded in the channel. As a reminder for our live audience, please mute your microphone. And without further ado, Sharmila, the stage is yours.
Hi, everyone. It is a great honor to be here. Thank you for giving me a chance to talk about my work. So today what we're going to do is we will do a brief introduction to anti-trafficking to make sure that everyone understands what this legal regime looks like and what the anti-trafficking ecosystem looks like. Then we will talk about how sex workers are represented in this discourse and what common interventions are used to deal with sex workers in anti-trafficking. And then we will assess these interventions and we'll bring in the voices of sex workers, which is my research intervention on this issue. And then we'll connect it to debating. So I do have a few slides to share with you, not throughout the entire talk, but for some part of it. And I'll put them up now. All right. Are the slides clear? They are, I think. So let's talk briefly about anti-trafficking first. So the primary legal basis of global anti-trafficking efforts is the Palermo Protocol that was passed in 2000. So it's actually a supplementary document to the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. So a majority of countries have signed on and ratified this protocol. The Philippines, the country I'm from, and the primary research site for my work was among the first countries to ratify it in 2002. So the definition of trafficking is quite technical and wieldy. And to break it down here, I'm just going to identify the core elements that's present in most anti-trafficking legislation globally. So trafficking is a crime that consists of 3 elements. One is the means. So means can refer to things such as recruiting, harboring, transporting, maintaining a person. Acts involve acts of coercion or deception or fraud or taking advantage of the vulnerability of a person. And it has to have a demonstrable exploitative purpose. So exploitative purposes like cover a range of things like sexual exploitation, the exploitation of the labor of a person, or even the harvesting of their organs. So this is a very bare bones definition, but it should help you understand the gist of the law. Different countries have different levels of rigor when they adapt this legislation domestically. So in the context of the Philippines, we took it a step forward and we applied anti-trafficking law even to domestic cases, whereas the international definition really just applies to international cases. So broadly, the goal of anti-trafficking legislation is to end both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So these are like the broad categories that they use to characterize the cases involved. I am not a big fan of this distinction, and you're going to find out why later on. But broadly, this is the distinction that is used. And of course, the big question, this is really where a lot of the debates lies. How do we go about doing this? And even if we have good intentions, might there be unintended consequences when we impose restrictions on people's mobility? What are the human rights consequences of these interventions? These are things we will investigate today. One thing I will say about the anti-trafficking protocol and its adaptation in many local and domestic contexts is there is a strong emphasis on a criminal justice-based approach. So the provisions in the protocol that require prosecution and punitive action against perpetrators are mandatory. But the provisions on assistance and support for victims are largely discretionary, which already should clue you into the dominant paradigm really behind the anti-trafficking architecture. Based on the data we have in terms of global conviction rates and prosecution rates and services like shelters and rehabilitation that are offered to trafficking victims, there has been a disproportionate focus on sex trafficking and on female victims, as opposed to labor situations like agricultural work or trafficking in fishing situations. Increasingly, more attention is being paid to male victims, but this is a very recent thing. And even then, you know, a lot of countries won't even have shelters for male victims, for example, or are unable to develop like strong victim identification processes that are targeted at male victims. So in the context of Southeast Asia, most of the Southeast Asian countries are considered source countries of victims, in a sense that there are high rates of poverty and social inequality. So domestically, there's a lot of internal migration, and that is seen as potentially a setting for trafficking to take place. And there's also strong labor migration from some Asian countries to the rest of the world. So within Southeast Asia, but also to the Middle East or to Europe. So for example, the Philippines, the top destination of some of our domestic workers top destination countries would be in the Middle East. Singapore is a bit different in that it is primarily a destination country rather than a source country. The Philippines primarily a source country. Countries like Malaysia and Thailand are both source and destination countries. So it's also important to keep in mind that Myanmar is in the region, and there is migration or illegal migration or asylum seeking that takes place there because of the instability of the state. Some institutions have attempted to document quantitative scope of trafficking victims that exist in the world, but by and large, in the scholarship, these estimates are widely criticized. First, countries don't have a consistent definition of trafficking, so they're not applying the same standards. Second, a lot of these things are clandestine industries. And third, many people who are identified as trafficking victims do not identify as victims. So by and large, the numbers we have are very, very unreliable. And so for example, the US Trafficking in Persons report, which is one, it does have a lot of political baggage in a sense that it is the US, ranking the rest of the world based on how they adhere to the US legislation on anti-trafficking, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. So despite the political baggage of this report, it is still considered a leading authority in assessing the efforts of governments worldwide to combat trafficking. And the US TFP report has stopped publishing estimates over the last 5 or 6 years in recognition of the fact that it really is very difficult to put a number to these cases. So that's a backdrop on trafficking. And as you've been warned, this is quite a critical perspective on anti-trafficking. And these are the research questions I explored in my PhD. One, how are different types of work represented in anti-trafficking discourse? So what types of work are represented as decent, and what types of work are represented as exploitative or inherently violent and indecent? And how do these representations compare with workers' lived realities? In particular, I'm talking about sex workers in this chat. Finally, how are common anti-trafficking interventions such as raids, rescue operations, and rehabilitation experienced by sex workers? So by and large, although there are shifts now and evolutions now in anti-trafficking discourse, the dominant perspective is that sex work is seen as inherently violence against women, and that women's choice to enter into sex work is entirely undermined by poverty and desperation. There is very little mention in the anti-trafficking discourse of male sex workers, although there are male sex workers, and they're not an insignificant population, but they are quite invisible in anti-trafficking discourse, which chooses to engage largely with women and children, and generally conflate women and children. So it's seen as inherently exploitative, can never possibly, reflect agency of the actors involved. The common interventions involve raiding commercial establishments that could be selling sex, like bars and massage parlors and spas and saunas, or raiding streets where sex workers might be soliciting. And a lot of times there's a focus on asking the state or directly offering services to sex workers to redirect them to other jobs. And we'll talk about that in a bit as well. So there are different models of regulating sex work that we see in the world. None of these divisions are as neat, but it helps to present you with the ideal types, just to understand what the ideological debates are. One is a model that fully criminalizes sex work, where anyone involved in the trade is treated as a criminal. The person selling sex, the person buying it, and people facilitating the trade. There is almost universal consensus that this is the worst model ever, especially if we recognize the vulnerability of the people involved. There is also the model that New Zealand uses, and with a record of empirical success, actually, or empirical improvement in the quality of lives of their sex workers, which is the full decriminalization model, which says people are free to buy and sell sex, but of course, if there are abuses, then sex workers are free to report these abuses to the police. They're also free to unionize and advocate for their rights and apply for benefits from the state. There is also, in between full decriminalization and partial decriminalization, the legalization model that is used in Germany. The difference here is sex workers have to register with the state, which some of them are not very happy with, because that compromises their anonymity and their security and their privacy. And there is the most popular model that is advocated in the anti-trafficking sector, which is the partial decriminalization model, but really should be called the end demand model. So this is the model popularized by Sweden, and I think this might be the topic of the current conversation in the Israeli context as well. So the model that lifts criminal penalties, so removes criminal penalties for sellers, but applies criminal penalties for buyers and third parties. So anyone who facilitates a sale, so a manager, the owner of the establishment, the person who rents the room, all of that. This is the dominant model that is being endorsed by the anti-trafficking sector, because the perspective they take is that it is not legitimate work, but we shouldn't punish the victim. We should instead end the demand for the work. And for some, it is seen as a sympathetic shift. So like as a sign of progress, because instead of treating them as criminals, we should now treat them as victims instead. Now, I do want to draw a parallel here before I go on to the rest of the lecture in more detail, which is the approach of the sector to other precarious work isn't to end the demand for this precarious work. It is to increase the autonomy of the workers to advocate for themselves. So in the same way that the anti-trafficking sector thinks that domestic workers or factory workers are precarious as well and vulnerable, their recommendation hasn't been to end the demand for factory work or end the demand for domestic work. It has been to increase the rights protections for these groups. But with sex work, they have decided, a big part of the anti-trafficking sector's consensus seems to be around ending the demand. So this is probably one of the last slides I'm going to be showing. I just want to quickly describe for you my intellectual journey into this topic. I actually used to work in a relatively senior position in a leading anti-trafficking organization in the Philippines. And I used to be involved in government consultations and in conversations with donors as well. And I used to hold the position that I just described earlier, that all sex workers are victims and that they needed to be rescued and redirected to more dignified forms of work. And for a few years of my life, this was my position. And my epiphany began when I was delivering a lecture in a school for social in a college of social work, where I was trying to persuade social workers in a national university to seek employment in the rehabilitation programs of anti-trafficking nonprofit orgs and the state, because we had a lot of those. So we had a lot of shelters and we were recruiting social workers. And I gave a very impassioned speech about all the interventions we had been undertaking to make lives better for sex workers. I talked about raids, I talked about success stories, and a lot of times the success stories I provided were individual anecdotes, because we never really had any aggregate scientific data to demonstrate that people's lives were necessarily better off after the interventions. But that is a situation in the development sector. There is very weak monitoring and evaluation. A lot of the money goes to salaries and to direct services and not much on evaluation, right? But I had all these success stories and I was quite proud of it. It turns out I had another guest speaker as well, who was introduced as a GRO, which in the Philippines means a guest relations officer, or a euphemism for someone who works in a bar and entertains customers and is likely to be selling sex as well. And this woman who was sat beside me refused to shake my hand. She refused to speak to me, and she was like really unhappy being next to me. And I was so confused, because I was like, I am working to make your life better. Why are you so rude? And when she starts speaking, she begins by saying, you know, if only people listen to us first before judging us and telling us how to live our lives, because some of you would rather that I leave my own kids, pick up a broom, and clean someone else's house and raise their kids for them. And I don't want to do that. And when she said this, I mean, I did get told, right? I probably deserved it. And when she said this, I realized at no point actually, in any of our policy conversations, global or local, did we consult sex workers on policies that did affect their lives. So this made me start thinking about maybe we're missing something here. I also did end up interacting with a lot of rescued women who were rescued, were placed in shelters, but eventually escaped. So they jumped out of the windows, they found a way to leave the shelter and never came back. Or who were rescued and stayed in the shelter, but were very, very angry and resentful and didn't want to be there. And they were angry that their work was disrupted or that they were being taken away from their kids. And I did speak to some social workers who would say the opposite. They would say prostitutes are our hardest intakes. You first need to convince them that they are victims, which I found a bit problematic. And when I started thinking about what I've said earlier, the different approach to sex work versus other precarious forms of work, in a way, domestic work is also very gendered work. It involves a lot of care work and a lot of unpaid emotional labor, especially when you're looking after kids. And we seem fine as a society to have these, to allow women to engage in these forms of labor, even if we still problematize it, but we don't try to end the demand for it, unlike what we've done for sex work. So these two figures continue to haunt me. The figure of the sex worker, the figure of the domestic worker, both are gendered forms of labor. One of them arguably upholds more traditional expectations of women, while one of them in some ways challenges it, because the sex worker, is a nocturnal being, occupies public spaces, which you don't normally expect of women, has sex with strangers too. But at the same time, yes, in a way, they are objectified by men, although I would argue that it's a bit of a simplistic reading. Nonetheless, why is it that we have such different reactions to these two forms of precarious work? Both are embodied forms of work, right? In the anti-trafficking sector, there's a lot of emphasis on listening to survivors of trafficking, which is fine, and survivors' voices are so important in designing policy. At the same time, survivors are given a discursive privilege, so they are hyper-visible to the exclusion of people who engage in sex work and continue to want to remain in sex work. So the voices of survivors are taken to represent the voices of the entire spectrum of individuals who work in sex work, which I thought was a bit dishonest as well, in that sex work is quite diverse. You have street workers, you have establishment-based workers, you have freelance workers who transact online, you have cam workers, although some cam workers do not want to identify as sex workers, fine. You have higher class escorts, you have student sex workers. So and they're not all women. The LGBT community is also disproportionately represented in sex work. So trans individuals who encounter job discrimination everywhere else are disproportionately represented in sex work. So I felt that this characterization might have been a bit too flat and too simplistic for such a diverse field. Nonetheless, the question I asked myself is, what happens? What are we doing about the ones who don't identify as victims? In a way, we are worsening the stigma on them because we are saying you can either perform being a good woman, or if you don't, then you probably deserve what's happening to you, or we refuse to engage with you or protect your work at all. So I became like more critical of this, and I looked at the rehabilitation project and thought of it as a bit too ideological, in a sense that what we're doing is we're creating virtuous women, but it is still a very like neoliberal context in that they are expected to work for their families. The kind of work that we sent them into involved things like hairdressing, baking, making jam, becoming factory workers or domestic workers, which we told them was more decent work. But this work in some ways is more labor intensive, but actually pays less. And there are only so many hairdressers you can have in one village, right? There are only so many fish vendors you can have. So I started like being very uncomfortable with a lot of these things. So let us stop sharing now. So the starting point of my research is a question of epistemic injustice. So this is a great book by Miranda Fricker. I think if you're into debating, this is something you'd want to read. It basically means certain groups of people are excluded from contributing to our collective understandings of how the world works by virtue of their identities. So it's a form of testimonial injustice when we say just by virtue of who you are less credible, and what you have to say is less important. And I think that is, in a way, what has happened to sex workers and policymaking. So that is my starting point, that they've been excluded from important conversations that affect their lives. And that there is an incentive structure within the anti-trafficking ecosystem that does incentivize a conflation of sex work with trafficking. So the biggest player in the anti-trafficking ecosystem is the US government, so US federal funding. The US State Department and USAID are the biggest donors of anti-trafficking programs. We are well aware of the role of the religious right and their influence over US funding. And this has translated into specific policies such as the global gag rule on abortion, for example. So USAID money cannot be spent on abortion, even if we are talking about 12-year-old rape victims in war zones, for example. And no US official is allowed to even talk about this. So another manifestation of USAID money being used to pursue certain ideological ends is no US federal funding that goes to a foreign organization or even a US organization implementing foreign projects and programs can go to a program that implicitly or explicitly condones support for sex work, or condones sex work or supports sex work. So it was challenged domestically, and the US courts ruled that they couldn't do it to projects and programs within the US, but it ruled that they could do it outside the US because the same free speech protections do not apply. So this means any organization that gets funding from USAID for anti-trafficking, for HIV prevention, or any of those programs must demonstrate that they are against sex work, and they must literally sign an anti-prostitution pledge in their contract, which means if you're a sex worker org and you were trying to access funds to, let's say, I don't know, get legal aid against police violence or to combat abuse by clients or police violence, you will not be eligible for US funding, which then changes the incentives of the major actors in this field. Like, you need donor money, and this is a compromise that some organizations have to make, like, in order to access donor funding. This is a slowly changing terrain because we have more donors coming in, but the US is still overwhelmingly the biggest donor. So that's one incentive, I guess. The second is the scorecard diplomacy that I alluded to earlier. So the US uses its trafficking in persons report to kind of discipline countries into engaging in anti-trafficking in a way that it prescribes. And for the longest time, the emphasis of this report, so the metrics of success, was largely prosecution-centric. So it was focused on securing convictions, which may not always be in the best interest of the individual involved, and which does not really address the structural variables that lead to trafficking situations in the first place, because they make it look like each situation is an isolated situation and that the villain is the individual perpetrator, when in fact, like, it might have been, you know, born out of poverty. And in many cases, if a lot of these victims do not identify their perpetrators as the villains, in fact, they identify them as people who have provided them with jobs and supports, and we'll chat about that a bit more. But so again, all of these problematic incentives, right? If you want to get a good ranking in the US Trafficking in Persons report, which is a point of pride for your government, or at least if you want to avoid a low ranking, which could translate into trade sanctions, then you will play by the metrics that they value. And finally, a cultural constraint, which is also part of an incentive structure, would be our gendered social morality. So the figure of the domestic worker and the sex worker that kept haunting me. The other issue that contributes to this epistemic injustice is that sex workers are regularly pathologized as damaged or incapable of rational thinking. So you always hear things like, because of the violence and the trauma that they've experienced prior to entering sex work and during sex work, like, they've had to dissociate themselves from their work and are therefore like incapable of adjudicating their best interest, which I find to be, and many other scholars find to be, quite problematic and an irresponsible use of medical discourse. It is true that in cases where we deal with victims, there are some situations where there is Stockholm syndrome, where we need to do some deprogramming, but at the same time, we cannot make this conclusion about an entire category of workers without even having spoken to them or engaged with them, especially in light of very many other workers having to disassociate themselves from their work in other situations as well. So it is surprising that this burden is being applied only to sex workers. So with all of this on my mind, I reached out to the Philippine Sex Workers Collective, which is a loose collective of sex workers in the Philippines that has a social media presence, but individual members are anonymous because sex work is still criminalized. So they could get jailed if they come forward publicly, and they also, they could get stigmatized and outed. So some of their family members don't even know. So I reached out to them on their Facebook page. This is a slide that I do want to share because it does speak to questions of how do we do ethical research with stigmatized communities. So my example in my life has been sex work, but this might as well apply to other stigmatized communities like drug users, for example, right? So I reached out to them, and their first response to me was one of like suspicion. Why are we going to trust you? You work for the anti-trafficking sector that has facilitated all these raids that have resulted in our colleagues being outed to their families and being like turned into, images for the media to feed on and sensationalize. And I was like, I understand completely where you're coming from. This is why I am reaching out to you. And for some reason, they decided to keep talking to me. And these were the things that they initially said, which I think is very fair. The first thing they said is, we don't trust academics because academics and researchers are extractive. You get data from us, you mine us for our private and intimate details and stories of exploitation and suffering. You get professional credit for that, but we are still the same. You have no accountability to us. There's no reciprocity whatsoever. The second criticism they made is academics distort our reality to fit preconceived notions about sex work. And they had so much anger against the anti-trafficking sector and other sex work researchers because they said, we told you stories of client abuse, we told you stories of violence, but we told you those stories because we wanted to make a case for why we should have more control over our working conditions, not because we wanted sex work to be ended, right? There are also very serious concerns about privacy and security, which is very fair and got worsened in the context of the Philippines under the Duterte regime, because the police, which is traditionally already in a very difficult relationship with sex workers, were given even more powers under his regime. So they were very concerned about being surveilled. They were worried about my potential working with the police and all of these things. And other researchers in the past have been quite careless with their names or with their data, or were very happy to like quote identifying information in their publications. I've had to make some decisions about what to reveal or what not to reveal, because for me, the safety of my informants is the most important thing. So, for example, the strategies that they use to avoid police abuse are incredibly interesting, but I am not going to publish that because that is going to make them more vulnerable. So it's a very fine line. They also they also wanted to make clear that they do not need saving, and that is the position a lot of academics and researchers take when engaging with them, this position of paternalism and pity and a desire to like save them, which they were quite resentful about. They are also very resentful of the fact that academics take platforms that belong to them and speak for them, which is a tension I regularly face because I do not want to crowd out platforms for them. At the same time, in the context of the Philippines, they have chosen to remain anonymous. So what I do is I just check back with them very regularly about whatever representation I make about the community. So in the end, they sent me this message, which I still have framed in my room, which is, "We would be happy to grant your request, but we are careful not to have this construed as a benevolent action on your part to help or aid us," which I think is fair. So my research model is very different to the traditional research model in that I treat them as my partner in knowledge production rather than simply as my object in research. So I don't even make any claims towards objectivity. So the research methodology is more feminist in orientation. Now, that doesn't mean I don't get to criticize my research partners, right? Because that would also be patronizing. So a feminist research methodology is aware of the limitations of the researcher. So our own positionality, our own biases, and our own ideological baggage, and how that might affect our interactions with the interview participants, for example. We also are aware that we do need, in some situations, to maintain a critical distance between ourselves and an interview participant, so we can still treat their responses and treat our interactions with them with a critical and academic eye. But at the same time, we demonstrate conscious partiality towards our participants, recognizing that they have been shut out of knowledge production as a process, and they have been shut out of policy conversations over their own lives. So it's a delicate balance. So one way to manage this is I have been very upfront about my limitations as well, and the limitations of my data in the research, in the dissertation. But at the same time, this kind of relationship with participants gives me a type of access that a researcher pretending to be objective never would have had. So one example I can give you is, it is well documented again in the literature that when you are dealing with a stigmatized population and they are not comfortable with a researcher and they are not sure whether you accept or respect what they are doing, they tend to default to a performance that minimizes conflict. So they tend to tell you what you want to hear. So they're going to give you sad stories and stories of victimization, because there is a desire for legitimacy and there's a desire to signal virtue, to counteract and to react against the stigma that exists. So you're not really going to get the full story. You never get the full story, but you're not going to get important parts of a story unless you build trust with the community. And the only way to build trust with a community is to establish some degree of solidarity and reciprocity with them, which I am completely happy with. So I think this is a form of scholarship / activism as well, where I do help them with grant proposals. I do help them with media engagements, but at the same time, I have made clear that I will discuss my research findings with them and take aboard their considerations, but I get to have final say and I get to be critical as well, which is an arrangement they accept. So this is what it means, I suppose, to have partners in knowledge production. They helped me design my research framework and my interview questions. They provided me advice on how to ensure the safety of my interviewees and how to manage distress during the interview process, how to properly compensate interviewees. So not overly incentivizing through material inducements, but at the same time, respecting the value of their time as well. What is the correct balance? So at one point, a common question that anti-traffickers and some feminists like asking sex workers is, was this your dream job as a child? Which members of the collective told me, please do not ask that very stupid question, because obviously it might not have been their dream job, but many workers don't work in their dream jobs. I mean, I wanted to be like a professional mermaid, but here I am, a PhD student. Like workers in McDonald's, that's not necessarily their dream job. So it's a really it's a question that comes from a place of privilege, but we only ask it of sex workers. And I'm like, actually, this is really fair. So they were very helpful in vetting these questions and helping recruit interview participants. Now, just a quick note on sampling before I talk about the findings and connected to debating is, I was cognizant that I was never going to have a random sample size, but anyone who is doing research on sex work and tells you that they have a random sample has no idea what they're doing. It is impossible to get a sampling frame for a clandestine community. And in my case, I knew that. So I started with a collective and asked them to help me distribute a call for interviewees. It was also hard for me to initiate contact with people because there are ethical considerations for stigmatized populations. So you don't want to put them on the spot or out them by suggesting to them that you think they are sex workers. So it had to be mediated by the collective. But I used the snowball sampling method where after speaking to a respondent, I would ask them to circulate my call several times over. And I also made sure to speak to members who were not members of the collective to potentially mitigate against an ideological skew. Because I recognize that members of the sex workers collective were likely to be a bit more political than the average sex worker. So I wanted to make sure to represent a range. So in the end, more than half of my 50 interviewees were not members of the collective and had not heard of them before. Okay, so I did 50, well, actually I spoke to over 100 sex workers, but in the end for my dissertation, I'm just citing 50 sex workers in Metro Manila. Most of them are street and establishment based. These are in the literature, they are again identified as the most vulnerable types of sex workers because they are more vulnerable to police detection. And in terms of revenue, they make less than the other types. So there are other types of sex workers like high class escorts and things like that. But I think that's a very different conversation in terms of their potentially economic desperation or their ability to screen clients or the kind of social and intellectual capital that they can use to bargain for their position in a transaction. So I don't really engage with that type of sex work in my work, and I deal specifically with street workers and establishment-based workers, which in a way is good because this is also the paradigmatic case of sex workers that the anti-trafficking sector is trying to rescue. So I get to engage with them on their own terms. And what I found was many of the sex workers I spoke to were single mothers or had been single parents for a significant period of time, and therefore the higher hourly rates that they made in sex work and the flexible hours were an important consideration when they chose to engage in sex work. So the minimum, a Filipina domestic worker who works overseas in a Middle Eastern country or wherever makes $200 a month. An average domestic worker in the Philippines makes $100 a month if you stay with a different family and do work with them every day except for once a week, right? A sex worker is likely to make, it varies wildly, and of course it's not as regular if you're a street worker, but makes that amount in a week or less with fewer hours of work put in, right? So they told me that some of them used to work in factories or used to be domestic workers, but they would not have time to care for their kids. So the argument is, if my kid gets sick, then I can't be there for them. Or if I'm absent from work, then I could lose my job or face huge deductions to my salary. So a couple of them who worked in factories were like, we got arthritis, we got back pain, we were late for 5 hours and had significant deductions. We had only a 5-minute break to pee every day, and genuinely felt that their work, sex work was a lot more flexible and they had more control over their working conditions. Those who worked as domestic workers, some of them did experience physical and sexual abuse from their employers, and those who left the Philippines had to pay huge fees to recruitment agencies and training centers to even land the job in the first place. So their first 3 months is spent paying off debts, which is again a disincentive to reporting abuse. So these things are not exactly the working conditions that are not the same as what my sex worker interviewees experienced. I experienced more freedom in sex work. Now, in terms of the work, I suppose in terms of the operating model, some of the women I interviewed operated without third parties. So they just transacted on their own on the streets. Many of them did have managers or pimps. And they explained that this is necessary because the pimps are the ones sometimes with connections with the police to pay the bribes and get the police to stop harassing them, or who are able to screen clients. So if a client is aware that you have someone, tracking you and taking note of your whereabouts, they are less likely to be abusive. Pimps are also necessary for marketing, apparently. Their relationship with their pimps was far more complex and fluid than what is traditionally portrayed in the literature, because in the literature, what we always see is pimps are exploitative, take all of your money, beat you, and get you addicted to drugs, which isn't quite the situation. In some situations, they were very close to their pimps and thought that they were like friends. So for some of them, when they had to get an illegal abortion because it's completely illegal in the Philippines, it was their pimp who was holding their hand and paid for it. Or if they need to borrow money, the pimp is the first one to lend them money at no interest. For some of them, of course, it was not as benevolent, but they are aware of this. So they're not dupes in that way. They kind of recognize that it is exploitative. And some of them say that if they had more control over their working conditions, then they wouldn't have to rely on these pimps in the first place. So those of them who work in bars, the bar usually gets a cut when a client asks to take a sex worker out. And so what they do is sometimes they just transact with the client outside the knowledge of the bar so that the bar doesn't get a cut. And, they have a lot of funny anecdotes about this. So relationship with pimps, a bit more complex than what is portrayed in the literature. Next, so as I've said, some of them find it to be more convenient, less dehumanizing, potentially safer. And I think the next set of answers I'm about to describe, I was able to access these answers only after really gaining their trust, because initially they talked a lot to me about sacrifice and love of their children and motherhood as an important motivation, which of course is true. Like I think it is a way of demonstrating virtuous mothers, right? In fact, they said, people call us bad mothers for being sex workers, but they'll also call us bad mothers if our children starve and die. So you're screwed either way. So this is a better way of being a good mother. And I absolutely believe that. At the same time, as I got closer to them and as I met them more often, they would start cracking jokes like, I am too beautiful to be scrubbing toilets. Or I genuinely enjoy the gifts I get from my client. Or I like the attention that men lavish on me, or that I am young and beautiful and this isn't going to last forever, so I'm going to take advantage of it. And so in some cases, they also found it to be personally rewarding, and enjoyed the relationships they had with their regular clients, which they consider to be more than just sex. So the women I spoke to also had different moral worlds. So most of them thought that what they were doing was acceptable because it was, for their families. A couple of them felt that selling sex was immoral, but that they had no choice. Regardless of their moral worlds, though, or their ethical worlds, they all agreed that this is something they had to do and that it is unfair to prevent their clients from, to criminalize their clients or to take away their market. So they always said, if you want to declare a war on poverty, not on prostitution. So just give us the power to control our working conditions, or present us with significantly better alternatives, not the fake alternatives I talked about, right? They were also resentful of the claim that was made that you sell your body in sex work. So one of them was like, what do you mean sell my body? My body is still here. Like, I am selling my services. I'm not selling my body. Which then again got me thinking that a lot of our concerns about sex work is we imagine a certain relationship that people have with their bodies, right? That our bodies somehow are super connected to our essential selves. Which, for some people that might be the case. But to assume this to be the case of every single sex worker is problematic, because it precisely reinforces the objectification that we were trying to resist in the first place, right? So I would rather take their word for it when they say that they can make a distinction between their essential self and their body that is engaging in a sexual transaction, right? Another interesting thing that surfaced in my interviews is that they would use rescue and arrest interchangeably, which meant that their conception of rescue was almost that it was arrest. Of course, you are with the police, and the police is quite corrupt. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit. They also tended to use rehabilitation and detention interchangeably. So a lot of them saw their time in shelters actually as detention, and describe being released from detention as freedom. So I think these linguistic choices are quite telling. When I asked them what the primary source of abuse was, or which actors they were most afraid of, it was not their clients, it was not their pimps, it was overwhelmingly the police, who also happen to be in the front lines of most anti-trafficking interventions, which to me is really counterintuitive. And in rehabilitation shelters, I'll be a bit quick here. Many of them that I've spoken to were very conscious of the transactional nature of their stay in. They always felt like they were bargaining and transacting with their rescuers. So many of them were under the impression that financial assistance was contingent on cooperating with prosecutors to file a case against their perps, alleged perpetrators. Technically, this is not the case in law, but this is the impression many of them got from their interactions with the police, with the lawyers, and with social workers. Next, they also felt like they were being disciplined by the rehabilitation centers. There were a lot of moral regulations: no access to cell phones, no dates, no access to boyfriends, no makeup, no short skirts. You must wake up at a given time. There's a very regimented schedule. There was a lot of unpaid labor. They had to do cleaning, washing, anti-trafficking merchandise that was sold to the world as ethical, consumer products, and all of these things within these centers, which kind of is ironic because that is exploitative, and that is exactly what we were trying to avoid. And in many cases, they were encouraged to, I guess, perform the role of a good victim to the donors and to the funders. So they were encouraged to tell stories that would make people cry and make people donate money. And the women who complied with this were the ones who were rewarded with speaking engagements and with preferential treatment by the social workers. Oh, maybe you get an extra hour on Facebook or things like that. And those who refused to comply were more likely to face disciplinary sanctions. And some of them said, we look at the women around us and we see how their stories morph. In the first instance, when they tell their story, it wasn't so harrowing. All of a sudden, you have all these details now that are quite sensationalized. So I do think that while survivor stories are very important, we need more academic attention on the transactional relationship between rescuers and survivors as well. Because that is another, I think, form of soft coercion. In terms of recommendations, finally, I think whatever policy we make on sex workers need to be driving the discussion, so they cannot be excluded from it. Obviously, exit options should be available to those sex workers who want to exit, but exit should not be coercive, and benefits should not be contingent on your willingness to exit, which is the status quo in most of these programs. I also think in terms of our conversations, we need to focus more on the work part rather than the sex part, and treat them as workers and focus on their working conditions as a labor issue rather than a morality issue. In fact, in the words of one sex worker, she says, I don't need to defend the morality of my clients in order to be entitled to labor rights, which I thought was fair. Yes, it is not the burden of sex workers to show that their clients are good guys. Some of these guys are terrible guys, that's true. But the same can be said of many types of consumers in many industries, right? And sex workers are admittedly, in a way, facilitating the patriarchy perhaps, but they are only as complicit in promoting the patriarchy as, I don't know, factory workers are complicit in promoting capitalist exploitation. So I'm not sure we should be putting a burden on sex workers that we don't place on other workers. So my recommendation, along with more progressive anti-trafficking scholars and activists, is to treat sex work within a spectrum of forms of labor rather than as a separate category. Otherwise, we reinforce the stigmatization against this category, right? So in the same way you have forced labor and trafficking situations in domestic work and factory work, you could have it in sex work, but you don't generalize it to the entire category. And this is a view that is increasingly espoused by organizations like Amnesty International, the UN, the World Health Organization, Human Rights Watch, The Lancet, a medical journal, which talked about the unintended consequences of criminalization as well. I think the Nordic model is a bad idea. I don't think you are protecting people by telling them we are cutting off your demand and your source of business. I also think if you have fewer clients, that will drive the prices down, and these women have nowhere to go. I also think if your policy actually works as intended, then you lose the nice guy clients because they're afraid of the law, and therefore you end up precisely with the kinds of clients that you wanted to protect these women from. It also becomes a lot harder to screen their clients because the clients are hiding from the cops, and the cops will also surveil the sex workers in order to get access to the clients. So the moment you criminalize one part of the equation, you are criminalizing the entire equation ultimately. And so I think the best model here is full decriminalization with strong consultation with sex worker groups. Now, finally, I think this has been heavily alluded to, but some of the core debates that we can access here are questions of agency and consent, and how exactly do you define consent in oppressive situations? We cannot use the same bar of agency and consent when we are discussing things like, sex work or difficult relationships that we would use in general for people who don't have constraints, because the definition of in these cases, it is people choosing from a series of bad options and choosing the best option among bad options. So maybe this is a helpful way of thinking about consent and agency. It is also a helpful way of thinking about restrictive policies and how they might backfire and actually have unintended consequences. So if your intention is ending the demand, you might actually end up enfranchising the worst kinds of clients and actually driving the prices down and making the women even more vulnerable, which therefore means they will be even more desperate and less, if you're uncomfortable about the client, if you had many clients to choose from, you would be more willing to say, nah, something about you makes me uncomfortable. But if we've successfully driven away all those other clients, then you might be more willing to get into the car with a client you're less comfortable with. You might be more willing to engage in sex acts that you otherwise would not have done. So these are policies with good intentions, but very unintended consequences, right? So these are some debate applications, and very happy to answer more as well. I'll end here. Thank you.
So thank you for that very insightful and fascinating talk. So we have gathered a collection of questions from the community and from the team, some for myself. But before we start with them, if you're happy with it, we would like to get to know you a little bit more. And if you don't mind sharing how you got involved in this kind of research in the first place.
So I have always been interested in how the state and the market regulates the choices and the behaviors of low-income women. So what options we create for them, what interventions we think are good for them. And so this is why I ended up in anti-trafficking in the first place, because I wanted to protect people from abuse. But in the process, realized that we might have been also committing certain kinds of violence against these women by denying their agency. And then I realized that this is a question that is very hard to answer within the anti-trafficking space, just because of donor incentives and policy inertia. So even if I raised this question many times, internally, it didn't work. So I was like, maybe I do need a more academic and safer space from which to do this research, and then I will re-engage after.
So I assume that some of the people who are going to view this video will very much like to also get involved in similar research applications. Do you have any recommendations for people who are just entering the field or people that are just thinking about entering the field?
So I think it's really important to, especially if you're thinking of entering academia or research work, right, to think very carefully about your research questions and to be able to situate yourself in a broader conversation. So you ask yourself, what academic and policy conversations are already existing about this topic? What is known? What have people said about it? What are the gaps? What don't we know? Or what might be wrong about what we think we know? Or how does knowledge become legible in the first place? Like, who decides what is correct and what is not correct? And might there be a problem with that process, right? So where are you going to intervene? So you need to have like a clear conception of what gap you are addressing or what you are contributing to that conversation. And the moment you've solved that, you are more than halfway there. Because the moment you are able to demonstrate that, it is a lot easier to get funding for your work.
Do you have any specific recommendations for people who are interested to enter research specifically in gender areas or in even particularly in sex work?
Yes, so I think it is very important to be willing to set a lot of your ideological biases aside when working with these communities, and to be very, very respectful of their agency and their autonomy. So, and when making contact with these communities, to be cognizant of their boundaries, right? So I would absolutely, I do not think it is correct to do research on sex work without talking to a single sex worker. So any research of this kind, you need to be willing to engage with the primary stakeholders. And I don't mean just an interview or two. You need to immerse yourself in their world. So I, especially for gender studies, have a strong bias for ethnographic methodologies and like more informal interviews and participant observation type methodologies, which seems to be a trend in the discipline as well. Although in a time of COVID, fieldwork is quite difficult. So this is a thing to also consider. It's a thing that we are all having to rethink at the moment.
Thank you. So we've mentioned in the beginning that you're also a Gates Scholar, which is something that I assume many people are aspiring to. Would you mind sharing some recommendations or similar kinds of scholarships or different kinds of funding that you think that people should think about when they enter academia, or even in particular your field?
Yeah, okay, so I'll discuss Gates first and then the others. Gates is exclusively tied to Cambridge University. They fund master's and PhD programs. So once you apply to the university, you can put in a concurrent application to Gates already and just do that at the same time. It doesn't have, like, you just have to answer a few extra essay questions. In my experience, Gates was especially interested in my academic abilities. So they want to see that you are capable of engaging with high level like theory and academic work at a postgraduate level, so that you have the academic experience for it, perhaps a record of like some academic achievements, so at least good enough grades. You don't have to have the best grades. My grades weren't that great. And also like some degree of like research experience. They also care very much for the social and the public impact of your work. And your ability to demonstrate that you will have a public return on investment. So if you're able to explain why your work adds value to the world, what is your story in that regard, that is something that you really value. So that's Gates. And Gates isn't tied to, so it's not means tested. The Australian Leadership Award, which is another popular one, and the Chevening program for the UK, I abide by very similar criteria. So my interviews for the Australian Award and for Gates were very similar. So they wanted to know why the postgrad made sense for that point in my life. Like, why is it the next natural step for me professionally? Like, why not something else? Why not go into media? Why not go into another nonprofit? Like, why do you want an academic degree, for example? So that's Chevening and Australian Awards. The Fulbright program also kind of looks at a similar thing. Yeah, I think that covers what these scholarship programs would be looking for.
So you're one of the most, if not the most, experienced debaters in the history of our community. Do you think that debating played any part in your choices, or did it help you in any way when you started this part of your life?
Oh, I credit debating immensely for this. I think the ability to be willing to be disturbed, like to be willing to be troubled with your assumptions, to re-examine your priors, to get out of your intellectual comfort zone and to be willing to change your mind, I think is so important. And that's something I learned in debating, because in debating, you don't get to pick the side you defend, right? Sometimes you have to say things you don't really believe in. And then afterwards you realize, actually, there was more to that than I initially thought. And I've had my mind changed by being in some debates, or by interacting with debaters who were just really clever and presented me with data that changed my mind. So I am used to being challenged. And so I looked at this, data and had the intellectual humility to recognize, oh, my initial position might have been wrong here. So I credit debating a lot for that. And then eventually being able to sell your idea and pitch it to different audiences and to assume the best form of your opponent's arguments and then take it down are also things we get from debating. They've been really useful. Lastly, academia is really tough in the sense that you get brutal feedback from your supervisors and from your peers, and you are always surrounded by very driven, very clever people. So to be able to take negative feedback and just, roll with it and incorporate it in your work later on is what we are trained to do as debaters when we listen to judges and our coaches, right? So that was quite helpful.
By seeing the smiles of the people who are listening to the conversation live, it seems that you really struck a good chord with everyone in the audience.
Please debate.
Is there anything that you would have changed so far in retrospect of your career, things that you think may have placed you in a superior position in your life right now, looking back?
I wish I had taken more quantitative courses. So I wish I had done more economics courses or like more quantitative research methodology courses. Look, there's always a place for everyone in academia. There is a place for qualitative scholars. You're fine. You don't need to do quant. But I think it would have increased my ability to engage with other types of research and participate in those conversations. So I should not have let my fear of math dictate my academic choices too much.
It's a very fair comment, and also I assume that many of the people who are going to view this are going to find it quite useful. What are your future steps? Do you have them? Do you have a plan of how to continue from here, or where do you think the field is going to progress to?
So right now there is a big question mark because of all the funding cuts that universities are facing from the pandemic, right? And sadly, if you want to get rich, gender studies is not the discipline to go into. I'm just gonna put that out there already. There are a couple of options. So one option would be to just pursue the academic and the research track and to do a postdoc. Another thing I am particularly interested in, which is very relevant to debaters actually, is studying the political performances of populist leaders and looking at the performance of masculinity of leaders such as Duterte, Bolsonaro, and Trump in their campaigns and in their administrations and in how they've responded to COVID actually. So I might look into that, populism and masculinity and discourse analysis. One other option is to re-engage with the field. And one dream I have, so a long-term dream, is to put up a research studies institute on sex work, either in the Philippines or Southeast Asia, and to train like a group of younger scholars on how to engage with the issue in a way that upholds the agency of sex workers and how to do ethical research with that community. So that would find me going back to Asia for a while to run that. So yeah, these are two disparate visions, but they can be reconciled. And then my plan F is I could be teaching debating also.
Well, that sounds very attractive. So, we've taken a detour from actual questions on the content, and I would like to share with you. We did collect a priori some questions from members of the community based on the title of the lecture. So I'll share a few of them with you. So one of the questions that we've received is how do you think that the sex industry broadly, or maybe even just specifically in Southeast Asia, impacts the LGBTQA community at large?
So as I've said, I think trans individuals are disproportionately represented in this industry, and they experience violence on so many levels. So employment from their families, but also from clients sometimes who don't realize that they are trans and then engage in greater acts of violence against them. So that's one impact, and that is something that really needs to be looked into. There are a lot of members of the LGBT community who also engage in the sex trade. So we have a lot of male sex workers with a massive homosexual client base. The dynamics there is a bit more different. I think they still are vulnerable, especially by virtue of having to work in an illicit working environment, right? But the kind of vulnerability even they would say is not exactly immediately equivalent to the vulnerability that a female sex worker will experience. So cops are less likely to beat them up or extort them for sexual favors, for example. Cops will extort them for money. But even their clients are less likely to beat them up or abuse them than you would a female sex worker. So the risk exposure is also a bit different. But I don't want it to sound like they are not, struggling, because they also are. Yeah, it is quite diverse, but the LGBT community is represented in the sex work community.
So another question that we've received is, do you think that the legacy of Western colonialism still affects sex trade in the area today? And if so, how?
Oh, absolutely, in so many ways. So it is almost impossible to talk about prostitution or sex work in the Philippines without reference to US bases. Because when American bases were there, it also created a sex trade all around it. So a lot of people migrated from poorer provinces to the bases to service, military men. And I mean, absolutely, this is an illustration of class inequality and racial inequality, and the policies that were imposed as well, right? We restricted the health practices of the sex workers and screened them very aggressively, but we didn't the clients. So the assumption was the men needed to be protected from the women. It was the women who were at fault if there were STDs that were spread. Obviously, there were lots of colonial relationships that were projected onto those interactions. And to this day, and then when you combine that with nationalist frameworks, to this day, it is so easy to conceive of that kind of prostitution as reflective of a colonial relationship in a different form. And you can never have a chat, as I said, about sex work without reference to that. At the same time, women have individual histories that have kind of been ignored. So when the bases were kicked out of the Philippines in the 90s, feminists were celebrating because we were like, yay, clients are gone. A bunch of sex workers actually held a protest because they were very upset about losing work. But this is never talked about. There is 2 stray newspaper articles that I found about it, and I managed to interview the women, and they were like, yeah, no one were interested in what we had to say. They were all interested in saving us. So this is, yeah, I mean, it is, colonialism is a big part of it, but the conversation hasn't been complete.
Fascinating. So you've mentioned the US a couple of times in your talk in different contexts. How many of the norms there do you think are shaped off by international pressures and shaped off by international interactions versus what's happening locally?
As in within the context of the US?
Within the context of, I'm just trying to reflect the question as best as I can, just within the context of how much do you believe sex, body trafficking in the area is shaped by international norms beyond the part of what you've described that the US plays in the area?
I mean, we do exist in a global political economy where there is a division of labor, where we send migrant workers who are quite vulnerable and dependent on jobs overseas, right? So in that way, the situation is already ripe for abuse, and these workers are very vulnerable. I mean, that is true in that they are already in debt when they travel. They're in a foreign country. They don't understand the language. They're not entitled to political protection. A lot in the Middle East, they follow the kafala system, which means they confiscate your documents and your work permit, and your legal status in the country is tied to your employer. So the moment your employer is unhappy with you, you lose your legal status there. So you don't even have any leverage over your employer because you cannot threaten that you will find another employer. So it's not even a free market in that regard, right? So these are slavery-like situations. They've been described to be slavery-like situations. I prefer to call them vulnerabilities or labor issue problems, labor justice problems. So in a sense, the way the international economy is structured and our dependence on labor export makes countries like the Philippines quite vulnerable, poorer countries quite vulnerable. At the same time, a very restrictive policy that increases the barriers to migration is also likely going to backfire by stimulating an underground economy. So we need to be very careful about how we intervene here.
Just as a follow-up to that, how much do you have an intuition of how many of the insights that you were able to gather from working in this area are universal into trafficking and sex work. For example, in the West, shame and stigma obviously play a major part in preserving these industries and in shaping how they look like. Do you think that there are many other elements that also replicate into other regions, or that the regions are fundamentally different, and if so, how?
No, I don't. I mean, so obviously poverty and economic desperation play a role. But a lot of the sex workers, even in Western countries, are also from poor communities or migrant workers. And I'm talking about the ones parallel to here. You have a more well-developed like online escort industry in Western countries. People are more internet savvy, and I think they're less precarious, but they're still precarious.
Mm-hmm.
That's less likely to be the case in the Philippines. But in terms of variables like stigma or repressive legislation, the Philippines and the US share so much in common, actually, because in the US, sex work is also criminalized. Even the sale of sex is criminalized, which is the worst model ever. And they are essentially exporting that, right? Uh, so, and a lot of these observations I've made have been made by other scholars doing similar work in Latin America, in India, especially in Bangladesh, in the US, and even in the UK. So the UK has where I'm based now, has a slightly different legal regime in that selling sex per se is not illegal, but everything else around it that you need to do to be safe is. So if you do it in public, or if you solicit in public, it is. If you are selling sex in a flat, so you're having sex with a client in a flat where another sex worker might be, hanging out for your protection, and you might be working together, that other sex worker can be prosecuted for facilitating. So if the act itself is legal but everything else around it isn't, then the vulnerabilities are similar still.
Yeah, I'll open the floor for our audience here if they have any questions that they would like to ask as well, things that they thought about during the lecture itself. So I'll try to moderate. Can you just raise your hand if you would like to speak? Yeah, Hadar, go ahead.
So one question that I had in mind when you described your research process was, given the variety or the spectrum of different experiences of sex workers, do you fear that in research there might be some sort of survivor's bias in terms of the certain individuals who are more comfortable approaching you and actually sharing their experiences might not be representative of the general community, might be more comparatively privileged or whatever?
Yeah, this is something I do recognize in my dissertation. I say, look, if it is true that we have these women who are like locked up in chains or being manipulated by their managers, who don't have whose mobility is being restricted, then these are not the women I'm able to access or talk to. The ones I've been able to talk to have the freedom to travel, to come to an interview with me and feel comfortable enough to be candid with me. So what I say here is, my conclusion isn't that these cases of abuse don't exist. So it's kind of the opposite of that, which is we've always assumed that everything looks like the prototype abuse case. But here is an example, or here are many examples of women who do not conform to that. So it was more about troubling the traditional assumption rather than arguing that there is no abuse. But that's absolutely true. And that's something that is very hard to correct for.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So you spoke about both giving a voice, but also being what do you say? Whatever. But also being able to give feedback. So did you have any conflicts either with the women you've interviewed or with the organization you talked about?
No. So thankfully, no. But I had to really manage expectations at the start and have a very frank and honest conversation with them, where I said, this is a research project, but I can't just write what you want me to write. I will also have to look at you critically. But at the same time, you already know that my starting point is that I respect the work you do and I don't think you are victims. And I have in interviews also called them out in a way, because sometimes in sex worker rights communities, there is a tendency to not want to acknowledge the violence that they experience at the hands of clients, especially in political advocacy, because the fear is if you acknowledge that, then you're acknowledging it is dangerous. Or at least you are afraid that that is the conclusion other people will make. So I've pushed back on this a bit. And I have also pushed back on the characterizations of like good motherhood all the time. And I'm like, are you sure that you have not spent any money on yourself at all? Because your cell phone looks really nice and you have gold braces. But you need to reach a certain level of comfort to be able to probe like that. So if there are tensions or inconsistencies, I do ask about it. And poke a bit more.
Are there any further questions from the audience? Yeah, Hadar, go ahead.
You mentioned quite a lot that you think that the conversation should view the work as the more important part than the sex in sex work. Would you, however, say that there are unique aspects of sex work unlike other aspects of exploitation or trafficking? And if so, what do you think is unique to sex work in particular, and why should we treat it differently then?
You know, to be honest, I can't give you an answer that differentiates sex from other forms of labor or other forms of embodied labor. I would genuinely struggle. And this is also something a lot of sex workers say. What might be different though, is not something that is necessarily inherent, but obviously the social cash behind sex work, that the political, the cultural, and the social baggage behind sex work, because as a society, we've chosen to define sex as special somehow or different. Obviously, you don't completely transcend that as a sex worker, right? And there is an argument I make in my dissertation that it's not like you have, discourse on one side and sex worker on the other side. The discourse kind of produces the sex worker too, because they live in the world and they are obviously shaped and affected by the things that are said about them and how they are thought about by society, right? So the whole discourse is a productive thing. And so my answer to you would be, I cannot give you an inherent difference, but I can definitely tell you that because of the social baggage we associate with sex that we don't associate with other labor acts, that weight is felt by the sex workers, and there are consequences of that difference in the form of the stigma they face. Or, some of them say, when I leave my house in the morning, I tell my family that I work for a fast food restaurant. I'm part of the service crew, and therefore I use the uniform of the service crew when I leave my house and then I come back. Or, funny stories of how, my child's school principal was one of my clients, and I didn't realize that. And when I had to go up on stage to shake his hand during my child's graduation, we both just pretended not to know each other. So these are things that they have to live with that maybe other workers don't.
Okay, so I think we'll ask a last question and then we'll wrap things up. To end in an activist tone, we've talked a lot about, problems, models that are better or not better, but what do you think individuals can do best now in order to make a change for the better in that regard? Assuming that they're not, heads of a huge research or state.
So fair. There are three things I can think of. One is, when you read or when you learn about this issue, try to read material that sex workers themselves have written or that sex worker orgs themselves have produced. They are quite easy to find online, or just go to my Facebook and I talk about it all the time. I am happy to share links too. So that's one, like be conscious of your sources. Two, funding is really important. Like if you are the kind that gives to like charities and things like that, consider dropping funding to sex worker orgs. Funding is so important in being able to advocate for your cause, right? So a lot of them cannot unionize in the first place, and very few funders fund sex worker orgs because they're not legally registered, they don't have like office space and things like that, which means they're paying for their activist labor out of their own pockets in many cases, right? So fund sex worker orgs. And the third is, if you are, this is a bit more controversial, I'm standing by it. If you are going to be a consumer of things like porn or sex work, be an ethical consumer. Treat these people like human beings. Tip well. Make sure that they are paid, right? So if you're going to engage in these practices, and by all means, whatever, like make sure you do so in a way that is as ethical as possible.
Shamila, that was fascinating. Thank you very much for it. The links to the presentation and also to the organization, perhaps if you're going to supply us with a list, we're going to place them on the YouTube channel, and also if you enjoyed this content and you've viewed it, please subscribe to the page. Thank you everyone that was here. Thank you to the gender team, and we hope gender open competition team, and we hope to be able to publish this as soon as possible. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we can do you can turn the mics back on now.